हेलो एवरीवन, वेलकम टू द लाइव सेशन। तो आज हम देखेंगे NCERT हिस्ट्री क्लास 11, जिसमें कि हम थीम 2 शुरू किए थे और उससे पहले दिन इंट्रोडक्शन पर थे और कल यहाँ तक पढ़े थे। तो आज यहाँ से शुरू करेंगे हम। तो अभी शुरू करते हैं। Controlling workers. Slavery was an institution deeply rooted in the ancient world, both in the Mediterranean and in the Near East, and not every Christianity, when it emerged and triumphed as the state religion in the 4th century, seriously challenged this institution. It does not follow that the bulk of the labor in the Roman economy was performed by slaves. That may have been true of large parts of Italy in the Republican period under Augustus. There were still 3 million slaves in a total Italian population of 7.5 million. But it was no longer true of the empire as a whole. Slaves were an investment, and at least one Roman agricultural writer advised landowners against using them in contests where too many might be required, for example for harvest, or where their health could be damaged, for example by malaria. These considerations were not based on any sympathy for slaves, but on hard economic calculation. On the other hand, if the Roman upper class were often brutal towards their slaves, ordinary people did sometimes show much more compassion. See what one historian says about a famous incident that occurred in the region of Nero on the treatment of slaves. Soon afterwards, the city prefect Lucius Pedernus Scandus was murdered by one of his slaves. After the murder, ancient custom required that every slave residing under the same roof must be executed. But a crowd gathered eager to save so many innocent lives, and rioting began. The Senate House was besieged. Inside there was feeling against excessive severity, but the majority opposed any change. The senators, favoring execution, prevailed. However, great crowds ready with stones and torches prevented the order from being carried out. Nero, rebuked and population by edict, and lined with troops the whole route along with which those condemned were taken for execution. A warfare became less widespread with the establishment of peace in the 1st century. The supply of slaves tended to decline, and the users of slave labor thus had to turn either to slave breeding or to cheaper substitutes such as wage labor, which was more easily dispensable. The practice of encouraging female slaves and their partners to have more children, who would of course also be slaves. In fact, free labor was extensively used on public works at Rome precisely because an extensive use of slave labor would have been too expensive. Unlike hired workers, slaves had to be fed and maintained throughout the year, which increased the cost of holding this kind of labor. This is probably why slaves are not widely found in the agriculture of the later period, at least not in the eastern provinces. On the other hand, they and freedmen, that is, slaves who had been set free by their masters, were extensively used by as business managers, where obviously they were not required in large numbers. Masters Masters often gave their slaves or freedmen capital to run businesses on their behalf or even businesses of their own. The Roman agricultural writers paid a great deal of attention to the management of labor. Columella, a 1st century writer who came from south of Spain, recommended that landowners should keep a reserve stock of implements and tools, twice as many as they needed, so that production could be continuous. For the loss in the slave labor, time exceeds the cost of such items. There was a general presumption among employers that without supervision no work would ever get done. So supervision was paramount. For both free workers and slaves, to make supervision easier, workers were sometimes grouped into gangs or smaller teams Columella recommended squares of 10, claiming it was easier to tell who was putting in effort and who was not in work groups of this size. This shows a detailed consideration of the management of labor. Pliny the Elder, the author of a very famous natural history, condemned the use of slave gangs as the worst method of organizing production, mainly because slaves who worked in gangs were usually chained together by their feet. All this looks draconian, but we should remember that most factories in the world today enforce similar principle of labor control. Draconian, harsh so called because of an early 6th century BC Greek lawmaker called Draco, who prescribed death as the penalty for most crimes. Indeed, some industrial establishments in the empire enforced even tighter controls. The elder Pliny described conditions in the frankincense factories of Phison of Alexandria, where he tells us no amount of supervision seemed to suffice. Frankincense, the European name for an aromatic resin used in incense and perfumes. It is tapped from boswellia trees by slicing the bark and allowing the exuded resins to harden. The best quality frankincense came from the Arabian Peninsula. A seal is put upon the mass on their hands, and before they are allowed to leave the premises, they have to take off all their clothes. Agricultural labor must have been fatiguing and disliked, for a famous edict of the early 3rd century refers to Egyptian peasants deserting their village in order not to engage in agricultural work. The same was probably true of most factories and workshops. A law of 398 referred to workers being branded so they could be recognized if and why they run away and try to hide. Many private employers cast their agreements with workers in the form of debt contracts to be able to claim that their employees were in debt to them and thus ensure tighter control over them. An early 2nd century writer tells us thousands surrenders themselves to workers in servitude, although they are free. In other words, a lot of poorer families went into debt bondage in order to survive. From one of the recently discovered letters of Augustine, we learned that parents sometimes sold their children into servitude for periods of 25 years. Augustine asked a loyal friend of his whether these children could be liberated once the father died. Rural indebtedness was even more widespread. To take just one example, in the Great Jewish Revolt of 66 CE, the revolutionaries destroyed the moneylenders' bonds to win popular support. A rebellion in Judea against Roman domination, which was ruthlessly suppressed by the Romans in what is called the Jewish War. Again, we should be careful not to conclude that the bulk of labor was coerced in this way. The late 5th century Emperor Anastasius built the eastern frontier city of Dara in less than 3 weeks by attracting labor from all over the east by offering high wages. From the papyri, we can even form some estimate of how widespread wage labor had become in parts of Mediterranean by 6th century, especially in the east. Social hierarchies. Let us stand back from the details now and try and get a sense of the social structure of the empire. Tacitus described the leading social groups of the early empire as follows: senators, patres, literally fathers, leading members of the equestrian class, the respectable section of the people, those attached to the great houses, the unkempt lower class plebs sordida, who he tells us were addicted to circus and theatrical displays, and finally the slaves. In the early 3rd century, when the Senate numbered roughly 1,000, approximately half of all senators still came from Italian families. By the late empire, which starts with the reign of Constantine I in the early part of the 4th century, the first two groups mentioned by Tacitus, the senators and the equities on knights or horsemen were traditionally the second most powerful and wealthy group. Originally, they were families whose property qualified them to serve in the cavalry. Hence, the name like senators, most knights were landowners, but unlike senators, many of them were sheep owners, traders, and bankers that is involved in business activities. Had merged into a unified and expanded aristocracy, and at least half of all families were of African or Eastern origin. This late Roman aristocracy was enormously wealthy but in many ways less powerful than the purely military elites, who came almost entirely from non aristocratic backgrounds. The middle class now consisted of the considerable mass of persons connected with imperial services in the bureaucracy and army, but also the more prosperous merchants and farmers, of whom there were many in the eastern provinces. Tacitus described this respectable middle class as clients of the great senatorial houses. Now it was chiefly government service and dependence on the state that sustained many of these families. Below them were the vast mass of lower classes, known collectively as humilores, literally lower. They comprised a rural labor force, of which many were permanently employed on large estates. Workers in industrial and mining establishments, migrant workers who supplied much of the labor for the grain and olive harvest and for the building industry. Self employed artisans who, it was said, were better fed than wage laborers. A large mass of casual laborers, especially in the big cities, and of course the many thousands of slaves that were still found all over the Western Empire in particular. One writer of the early 5th century, the historian Olympidorus, who was also an ambassador, tells us the aristocracy based in the city of Rome drew annual income of up to 4,000 lbs of gold from their estates, not counting the produce they consumed directly. The monetary system of the late empire broke with the silver based currencies of the first 3 centuries because the Spanish silver mines were exhausted and government ran out of sufficient stocks of the metal to support a stable coinage in silver. Constantine founded the new monetary system of gold, and there were vast amounts of this in the circulation throughout late antiquity. The late Roman bureaucracy, both the higher and middle echelons, was a comparatively affluent group because it drew the bulk of its salary in gold and invested much of this in buying up assets like land. There was, of course, also a great deal of corruption, especially in the judicial system and in the administration of military supplies. The extortion of the higher bureaucracy and the greed of the provincial governors were proverbial. But government intervened repeatedly to curb these forms of corruption. We only know about them in the first place because of the laws that tried to put an end to them, and because historians and other members of the intelligentsia denounced such practices. This element of criticism is a remarkable feature of the classical world. The Roman state was an authoritarian regime. In other words, dissent was rarely tolerated and government usually responded to protest with violence, especially in the cities of the East where people were often fearless in making fun of emperors. Yet a strong tradition of Roman law had emerged by the 4th century, and this acted as a brake on even the most fearsome emperors. Emperors were not free to do whatever they liked, and the law was actively used to protect civil rights. That is why, in the later 4th century, it was possible for powerful bishops like emperors to confront equally powerful emperors when they were excessively harsh or repressive in their handling of the civilian population. Incomes of the Roman aristocracy, early 5th century. Each of the great houses of Rome contained within itself everything which a medium sized city could hold: a hippodrome, fora, temples, fountains, and different kinds of baths. Many of the Roman households received an income of 4,000 pounds of gold per year from their properties, not including grain, wine, and other produce, which, if sold, would have amounted to one third of the income in the gold. The income of the households at Rome of the second class was 1,000 or 1,500 pounds of gold. Late Antiquity. We shall conclude this chapter by looking at the cultural transformation of the Roman world in its final centuries. Late Antiquity is the term now used to describe the final fascinating period in the evolution and breakup of the Roman Empire and refers broadly to 4th to 7th centuries. The 4th century itself was one of considerable ferment, both cultural and economic. At the cultural level, the period saw momentous developments in religious life, with the Emperor Constantine deciding to make Christianity the official religion, and with the rise of Islam in the 7th century. But there were equally important changes in the structure of the state that began with the Emperor Dic- Diocletian, and it may be best to start with this. Overexpansion had led Diocletian to cut back by abandoning territories with little strategic or economic value. Diocletian also fortified the frontiers, reorganized provincial boundaries, and separated civilian from military functions, granting greater autonomy to the military commanders, duces, who now became a powerful group. Constantine consolidated some of these changes and added other of his own. His chief innovations were in the monetary spheres, where he introduced a new denomination, the solidus, a coin of 4 grams of pure gold that would in fact outlast the Roman Empire itself. Solidi were minted on a very large scale and their circulation ran into millions. The other area of innovation was the creation of a second capital at Constantinople, at the site of modern Istanbul in Turkey, and previously called Byzantium, surrounded on 3 sides by the sea. As the new capital required a new senate, the 4th century was a period of rapid expansion of governing classes. Monetary stability and an expanding population stimulated economic growth, and the archaeological record shows considerable investment in rural establishment, including industrial installations like oil presses and glass factories in newer technologies such as screw presses and multiple water mills, and in a revival of the long distance trade with the East. All of this carried over into strong urban prosperity that was marked by new forms of architecture and an exaggerated sense of luxury. The ruling elites were wealthier and more powerful than ever before. In Egypt, hundreds of papyri survive from these later centuries, and they show us a relatively affluent society where money was in extensive use and rural estates generated vast incomes in gold. For example, Egypt contributed taxes of over 2.5 million solidi a year, roughly 35,000 lbs of gold, in the region of Justinian in the 6th century. Indeed, large parts of the Near Eastern countryside were more developed and densely settled in the 5th and 6th centuries than they would be even in the 20th century. This is the social background against which we should set the cultural development of this period. The traditional religious culture of the classical world, both Greek and Roman, had been polytheist. That is, it involved a multiplicity of cults that included both Roman or Italian gods like Jupiter, Juno, Minerva, and Mars, as well as numerous Greek and Eastern deities worshipped in thousands of temples, shrines, and sanctuaries throughout the empire. Polytheists had no common name or label to describe themselves. The other great religious tradition in the empire was Judaism. Judaism was not a monolith either. Monolith literally a large block of stone, but the expression is used to refer to anything, for example, a society or culture that lacks variety and is all of the same time either, and there was a great deal of diversity within the Jewish communities of late antiquity. Thus, the Christianization of the empire in the 4th and 5th century was a gradual and complex process. Christian, Christianization, the process by which Christianity spread among different groups of the population and became the dominant religion. Polytheism did not disappear overnight, especially in the western province, where the Christian bishops waged a running battle against beliefs and practices they condemned more than the Christian laity did. Laity, the ordinary members of a religious community, as opposed to the priest or clergy who have official position within the community. The boundaries between religious communities were much more fluid in the 4th century than they would become thanks to the repeated efforts of the religious leader. The powerful bishops who now led the church to rein in their followers and enforce a more rigid set of beliefs and practices. The general prosperity was especially marked in the East, where population was still expanding till the 6th century, despite the impact of the plague which affected the Mediterranean in the 540s. In the West, by contrast, the empire fragmented politically as Germanic groups from the north, Goths, Vandals, Lombards, etc., took over all the major provinces and established kingdoms that are best described as post-Roman. The most important of these were that of the Visigoths in Spain, destroyed by the Arabs between 711 and 720, that of the Franks in Gaul, and that of the Lombards in Italy. These kingdoms foreshadowed the beginnings of a different kind of the world that is usually called medieval. In the East, where the empire maintained united, the reign of Justinian is the high water mark of prosperity and imperial ambition. Justinian recaptured Africa from the Vandals, but his recovery of Italy from the Ostrogoths left their country devastated and paved the way for the Lombard invasion. By the early 7th century, the war between Rome and Iran had flared up again, and the Sassanians, who had ruled Iran since the 3rd century, launched a wholesale invasion of all the major eastern provinces, including Egypt. When Byzantium, as the Roman Empire, was now increasingly known, recovered these provinces in the 620s. It was just a few years away, literally, from the final major blow, which came this time from the southeast. The expansion of Islam from its beginnings in Arabia has been called the greatest political revolution ever to occur in the history of the ancient world. By 642, barely 10 years after the Prophet Muhammad's death, large parts of both the Eastern Roman and Sasanian empires had fallen to the Arabia in a series of stunning confrontations. However, we should bear in mind that those conquests, which eventually, a century later, extended as far afield as Spain, Sindh, and Central Asia, began in fact with the subjection of the Arab tribes by the emerging Islamic State, first within Arabia and then in the Syrian desert and on the fringes of Iraq. As we will see in theme 4, the unification of the Arabian Peninsula and its numerous tribes was the key factor behind the territorial expansion of Islam. तो ये है इस चैप्टर का टाइमलाइन, जिसमें कि रूलर्स और उस टाइम के इवेंट्स के बारे में दिया गया है, और ये है इस चैप्टर का एक्सरसाइज। और यहाँ पर हमारा आज का चैप्टर ख़त्म होता है। तो आज की वीडियो के लिए इतना ही। डेली लाइव क्लास के लिए चैनल को सब्सक्राइब कर दीजिए और नोटिफिकेशन आइकन पर क्लिक कर दीजिए, और वीडियो अच्छा लगे तो लाइक कर दीजिए। थैंक यू, थैंक्स फॉर ज्वाइनिंग।